you haven't moved. You're still in the back seat. Back seat, back corner, man. I'm going to come back there and lecture right in your ears.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Hi, how are we doing tonight?
Very good.
Good. Welcome to October's McCauley Lecture. Tonight we're going to be exploring a gathering point of the American story, Harpers Ferry. Published in honor of Harpers Ferry's National Historical Park's 75th anniversary, Confluence, Harpers Ferry's Destiny focuses on the human experiences of Harpers Ferry that is both sweeping and intimate, as well as perspective on the rebirth of the war and flood-ravaged town as a national park. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing two of our speakers, Dennis Frye and Catherine Mägi. Yes, Oliver. Dennis served 20 years as the chief historian at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park. He has authored 11 books and 104 articles, writing for every major Civil War publication. Catherine is also an award-winning writer and storyteller. Her inspiration is drawn from the ferry and from the historic mountain farm from which she lives. When she is not roaming the fields and mountains gathering stories from the earth, Catherine works as a librarian, helping her community connect to its own stories. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dennis and Catherine as they discuss Confluence, Harpers Ferry's Destiny.
Well, is this working?
Yes.
Okay, good. It's coming through. Good. It's great to be here tonight in that I've had the great opportunity over the years to do many programs. Well, come on in. Hi. Do many programs over the years as part of the McCauley Lecture. In fact, I just speak with Elizabeth a moment ago. I'm pretty sure I hold the record, and I don't know if that's because I am actually a good speaker or because John Frye said you're speaking. I really don't know about that, but I did have connections, and it's always been a pleasure to come and speak. And in fact, I was sharing with Catherine en route here this evening that I think the first program I did here for McCauley, before it was McCauley, I think even before they were sponsoring it, was in 1981. So think about 41 years ago, I gave a program on Maryland Heights and the Elk Ridge during the war. And I'll never forget, Charles Blank was the director of the library at that time, Mr. Blank. And Mr. Blank, before he became director, was the deputy director, and one of his jobs was to come to the historical lectures, and to record them. That was his job. Poor Mr. Blank. He hated history. He really did. He hated history. I can remember, because I came to the lectures in the 1970s with Dan. I was just a kid, but I loved them. And I'd come and I'd sit near Mr. Blank, and Mr. Blank would turn the recorder on, sit back in his chair and go fast asleep. And sometimes he'd snore away while the speaker's out there. This is the deputy director of the library. And what would wake him up was people would clap at the end, and then he'd see. It was great. So the night I was supposed to lecture, there was Mr. Blank. Mr. Blank was in the audience. And I was somewhat terrified because I thought, I don't want to put the deputy director to sleep. And but I had a really dramatic program planned, and it really was designed to be dramatic. And it went over very well with the audience. And I noticed throughout, Mr. Blank never went to sleep. He stayed with us the whole time. And I knew at the end of that program had been a success simply because he didn't snore while I was speaking. It turned out to be so successful that he went to Dad. This is library history, personal library history for me. He went to Dad and he said, that boy's really good. I want you to bring him to work here at the library. I want him to be your assistant in the Western Maryland. And so sure enough, I was hired by Charles Blank, the director, to be Dad's assistant in the Western Maryland River. And I did that for about 25 years. working for Dad on times when he was on vacation. Friday night was my night. I was always up here on Friday nights. And it was a great experience. I got to meet people like you. I had opportunity to do a lot of research, answer a lot of questions, meet a lot of genealogists. In the days when genealogy was hard to do, long before we have a much easier way of doing it now through Ancestry. So anyway, just I want to dedicate the program to Dad. If that's okay with you, Catherine. Dad's not here this evening, which I'm disappointed by. It's the first time I've spoken. He's not been in the audience. I know it was always weird when he had to introduce me. And I know he was so happy when he finally handed that over to Elizabeth. Elizabeth had to introduce him. But you know what was even more weird was I worked directly for Dad in the library system. And he had to evaluate me every year. And Mr. Blank didn't care, and neither did Mary Bicott. She didn't care. I always got great ratings, of course. But it was a great experience being here in the library. You know, Catherine and I tonight, we're very excited about presenting this. It's really sharing this with you. We're going to be sharing this with you this evening because what we're sharing is part of our souls. Harpers Ferry. You know, I had the privilege of working Harpers Ferry for about 35 years at the national park. And when every day I came in to the park, and I can thank you for giving me that privilege because I worked for you. You were my boss. I was a public servant wearing the national park uniform. Thank you for giving me that great privilege of being a national park ranger at Harpers Ferry. But every day when I would come in, I would come in with the attitude of, I'm not here to work, I'm here to worship. That was my attitude. Because Harpers Ferry is a place of worship. And that's how we present Harpers Ferry in Confluence. It's not a book about religion, it's a book about how Harpers Ferry affects you, how it infiltrates your soul. It becomes part of you. It exists with you. It helps guide you and mentor you. And it is such a cleansing and invigorating place. And all of you know that. All of you know that. All of you have been there. And so it's really, we talk about how are we going to share Harpers Ferry with an audience that knows Harpers Ferry? And how do we do that in such a way that we present something that may be new and fascinating to you? So I think we've got a way to do it. This will be a very different type of program. All of you know I've never given a program with another person. I don't do that. But if I am happy it's Catherine. And all of you know that I've never written a book with another person. But Confluence is ours. It belongs to both of us. We are the co-authors. And that wasn't the original plan. It was going to be my book. As soon as I retired, I started working on it. It was a 40-year dream to write that book. There had been no other book written on Harpers Ferry that, in my mind, was comprehensive, that covered all the story and did it in such a way that was the storytellers themselves. Let the people who experienced Harpers Ferry and all of its drama and all of its trauma, let them tell their stories to you. And so that was my approach. Find the stories and the illustrations so that when you would pick up the book, you would learn a lot about Harpers Ferry, no matter how much you thought you already knew. Well, at the time, Catherine, an attorney, was taking a sabbatical from law. And she came to Harpers Ferry to invigorate herself and revitalize herself. And she was working for the nonprofit organization that supports Harpers Ferry National Park, the Harpers Ferry Park Association. And so I met her and had no idea that when it was time to actually start working on the book, and I wanted the nonprofit to publish the book. They were going to be the publisher because I wanted the proceeds from Confluence to support the national park. Even after I was long gone, I wanted money from this book to go support the park. So I wanted them to be the publisher. Well, the executive director did something that completely stunned me. She said, well, you need help. And I kind of looked at her and said, I don't need any help on Harpers Ferry. I don't need any help. Oh yeah, we're going to give you some help. And so Catherine was presented as the association's liaison with me. And it didn't take me long to discover that Catherine had as much passion for Harpers Ferry as I had. I didn't think that was possible. But here was one that felt Harpers Ferry as much as I did. And we had a symbiotic relationship soon that began to flourish with regard to the creative energies and doing the research and putting this together. So in many respects, it was a confluence not just of the rivers, and it was not just a confluence of me in retirement deciding to write a book about the confluence, but there was a confluence here that I didn't expect that gave us an opportunity to collaborate very closely on this book. So our presentation tonight is really going to be from the perspective of we want to share with you stories. And Catherine has a story that never will match mine.
Still working? There we go. Okay. Is it still? Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Dennis. So this evening, the story I'd like to share with you is a story that was handed to me by my dearest friend in Harpers Ferry. A friend I wish that I could bring here with me tonight to introduce to you all, to give it to you herself. But she is very, very old, and it's very difficult for her to travel. I thought for a moment that we might somehow arrange a group visit to bring you all to see her. But that, of course, is quite complicated. Again, you can understand this, bringing a large group like this to see someone who is quite so elderly is quite complicated in itself as well. But she has witnessed so much of Harpers Ferry's story, and she has taught me so much as well. She has taught me about survivorship, about endurance, about strength. She has taught me so much. And as I said, she has been a witness to much of what we put in the Confluence book, and much that we didn't know ourselves, much that we could not have experienced ourselves. Dennis, how old do you think she is?
180 years old.
That's kind of rude. I'd say she doesn't look a day over 175. That's probably about right. We are talking about a house. And not just any house. For several years, it was my privilege to call a very special house in Harpers Ferry my home, and to discover its story and all that it had witnessed. And many of those stories are in Confluence. It reflects much of what has become familiar Harpers Ferry historical experiences, and some of them are new stories. But we're going to share those stories with you tonight. Now, my house has a name, which I will share with you tonight so that you may be properly introduced to her. Her name is the Dear Old House.
Now, when I first met her, it had been a very long time since anyone had thought of her as deer. She was a house that could be smelled before she could be seen. When I first met the dear old house, she was, unfortunately, the sort of house that had been allowed to sit for a while, unloved and unwanted. And when I first shuffled inside, I did in fact shuffle because you could not see the floors themselves. They had a few inches of fecal matter of various animals in various states of decay, dried, smushed, sliding. And it was rather a precarious walking about that had to occur with me and my realtor, who kept wondering why I wouldn't be interested in a lovely townhome, please. But no, there I was in the dear old house. And I crossed that precarious door, precarious not because it was weak. She was never weak in her entire history, no. Weak, not ever. Precarious again because of this detritus that was covering her existence, trash, all forms of nastiness. And I find that this section in the back of the house that I know at once to be an original exit way. There's been an addition that's been created over time, but I know that this is an original exit way of the back of the house. I can tell by the old wood framing. I see lock plates, the scars of old lock plates. I see the scars of old hinges in this woodwork. And I see the wonderful old scars where some deliciously thick old wooden beam once barred that door and held it fast in the most rustic of locks. And I sat there and could not help myself. I had been holding my scarf like this because of the stench of ammonia in this poor, sad old house. But I had to drop the scarf and reach out my hand and touch those scars and trace each one with my fingertips and wonder about all those people who had passed through them, about every time that old back door had slammed, whether it had been children running through excitedly or someone running through in fear because I already knew, without knowing anything else about the dear old house, I already knew that I was on a battlefield. And while my realtor was still in the background saying, there's a lovely new development with lovely new townhomes, I said, that's okay. I'll take it. And so began our adventure. So this was, as I said, I already knew it to be a battlefield house. Harpers Ferry, of course, is home to its own great battle. And we have just passed the 160th anniversary of that battle in 1862. But what does it mean to be a battlefield house? Of course, in this area, there are so many battlefield houses. You tour any number of battlefields around here, and we have houses that have all sorts of historical markers in front of them. But what does it mean? What does it mean to have survived a battle? I wanted to know what my house had experienced sitting there on a battlefield. And I could figure this out because my house still sits on preserved battlefield land. Somebody thought it would be a good idea to put cannon up on the hill and interpret Civil War history and have artillery demonstrations.
That was mine.
So I can have this experience for myself. I have read, as I'm sure many of you have, account after account of people seeking shelter inside houses during battles, of crawling into whatever space they can find to get away from it all, to find that space. And I wanted to know what that had been for myself. I didn't want to just read it in a book anymore. I wanted to know, how does a house react? So come with me now, down into my wild, untamed cellar of the dear old house. That's what I always called it. I cannot stand up in this space. We have to go down into the dark. The stairs are carved out of the bare rock. The chisel marks are still in the rough wall. As we crawl down the sides, curving, don't slip on the wet rocks that are still dripping out of the mountainside from the water that seeps out of the hill of Oliver Heights. Let's find a place where we can sit against the very back of our house, away from the window, just a little bit of light coming in through the very top of that cellar window. And let's wait, because we know that artillery demonstration is going to start any moment now. It's surprisingly quiet when it comes, just that soft. What I was unprepared for is what comes through the earth itself, through the mountain, up through the earth. What I was unprepared for is what comes up through the ground, through the rock, the vibration that comes up through your bones, through your ankles, up through your shins, up into your kneecaps, and vibrates through you, through the house itself. I expected the dust to fall from the floorboards above me. I was ready for that. I was not ready to feel the cannon fire of a single gun in my spine. That was just one gun firing a blank. That is a house on a battlefield.
And during the Battle of Harpers Ferry, you just felt what one gun did in a demonstration on September the 14th, 1862, 3 days before Antietam. The number of cannon firing are nearly 130 pieces of artillery. Pounding. Bolivar Heights, her home. Her house, incidentally, was the last house on Bolivar Heights before you come into the open ground. So it was an easy target if they decided to target it. I'd like to share with you something this house witnesses, which happened just a couple days ago, 160 years ago to the date, October the 1st, now that we're in October. The witness, the dear old house, which sits on Washington Street, the main street, had a very distinguished guest walk by, ride by, or carriage by, perhaps 1, 2, or 3 different ways. We're not sure exactly, but we do know that Abraham Lincoln is on Bolivar Heights on October the 1st, exactly 160 years ago this year. And he is there, the president, reviewing portions of McClellan's army that has been victorious in the Battle of Antietam. So this is 2 weeks after the battle. And the dear old house has an experience with the President of the United States. Just seeing him, just witnessing him as he was there. The dear old house was built long before the Civil War. And Catherine knows its story.
Like many things in Harpers Ferry, the story of the dear old house does begin with guns. The dear old house was created as a dwelling for workers at the U.S. Armory at Harpers Ferry. It is not a grand house whatsoever. There are many grand dwellings for Armory employees, supervisors in Harpers Ferry. But this is a very simple Armory workers' home. A very common design that was at one time repeated quite often throughout Harpers Ferry. As the Armory was growing and growing, there was a need for this new concept of government employees to have housing. And so the armory bought up several lots and repeated this very common pattern again and again and again. It's found throughout Harpers Ferry as well as throughout the neighboring village of Bolivar. Those blocks are not so consistent as they once were because of destruction by war and in some places flooding. But this is what this was. The armory also, the dear old house at this time, as part of the armory, was part of this whole expansion of the Harpers Ferry, really part of that heartbeat of what drew Harpers Ferry, made it a destination, made it something that could become a living place and a workplace for so many others, and made it a place of evolution and revolution.
It's really difficult to envision Harpers Ferry as wild. Now, we think of it as wild because of the mountains that we see and the rivers that carve its way through and the rapids that we experience. We think of Harpers Ferry as wild, but it's not the wild George Washington experienced, when virtually no one lived there, when the rivers were completely untamed, when there were almost no buildings, where Washington almost drowned just below the confluence. He talks about that in his own writings. And so Washington, I used to like to tell people when we would do tours at Harpers Ferry that somebody bring out a dollar bill, just pull out a dollar bill and show me your dollar. So the tourist pulls out a dollar bill and I'll give it back to him. I'll take the dollar bill for a moment and I'll say, look at that. And people are looking at it. And of course, there's Washington. And I said, every time you pull out a dollar bill, think of Harpers Ferry, because Washington is the reason that we have an armory at Harpers Ferry. Washington selects that site for an armory, along with a lot of support from the Congress and various studies recommending that the United States needed to defend itself, that we could not defend ourselves, that we were dependent upon others to defend for us. And so the armory commences with gun production after Washington not only has left office, but after Washington is dead. He never saw, never held, never witnessed an actual Harpers Ferry weapon, but he did set things in motion. And so Catherine and I spoke to a group of surveyors from all over the country who enjoy history at their associations, a group that actually studies history as professional surveyors. And we spoke to them about a week ago. And one of the points that we made was the surveyors were truly the original folks that were there to manipulate Harpers Ferry's power. The indigenous people, of course, did some of this with fish weirs in the river, and many of those still exist up and down the Potomac, as you know. But when the government, the federal government, comes along to establish the armory and builds a dam for the first time on the Potomac River, the power of that river is controlled and diverted. And the people that made all that responsible were engineers and surveyors working for the United States government, the Corps of Engineers, the War Department. And so envision those early surveyors along the river trying to figure where's the best place to put this dam? Where will we put the canal? How long will the canal be? How much power do we need? How much drop? How much force? How much machinery will be powered? All of those types of questions that are being answered before anything's been excavated and anything's been altered. So the very first alterations occur as a result of the armory. And the armorer who resided in the dear old house went to work there every day. would walk nearly 2 miles. It's almost 2 miles, right? One way, Catherine, isn't that correct? You used to do that walking.
1.4.
1.4 miles, one way from her home down to the Armory grounds. And so the dear old house becomes part of this experience of defending America. Every day, her residents, the dear old house residents, went to work. They were defending us. That was their job. That was their mission. The dear old house was the support structure behind the execution of that mission.
The dear old house also comes into being at a moment of real revolution in Harpers Ferry history, and really the entire history of this region. A sound is coming around the Harpers Ferry gap that has not been heard before.
Ever.
Ever. The sound of a train. And that is going to change life forever. The dear old house, when I was blessed to call it my home and be its caretaker, I loved to mark my hours by the train schedules. Of course, the sound that I heard was very different from a 19th century train whistle. We don't have that so much anymore. But I could still mark my hours by the trains that came and went in Harpers Ferry, knowing pretty much that that Amtrak train was always going to be at least an hour late. But yes, that train coming into Harpers Ferry would revolutionize life for those who lived in the dear old house. One of my favorite games to play as caretaker was what I called archaeology gardening. And I loved going out to dig, and the day that I started to find all of the oyster shells was really exciting for me. Because do you realize that we can't have oyster shells here unless they've been brought from far away? We don't have oysters, we don't have Chesapeake Bay oysters here. We have river oysters, and sometimes you can find some good sized ones. But the ability to get oysters from the Chesapeake Bay and other seafood from the coastal cities all the way here in Harpers Ferry and other western areas in the same day completely changed diets. It raised standards of living to a whole new level, new expectations. The taverns in Harpers Ferry were suddenly much more exciting places to dine and hang out all day. This was a true revolution, and it had consequences far beyond our menus.
So just to put this revolution in context, if I ask you, each one of you, what is your most valuable asset? What is it that each of us own? Each of us has this common ownership, but as individuals, that is an incredibly valuable asset. And I would get different answers, but the right answer is your time. Time. Time is a wonderful asset. Most of our lives, we don't own our time. Others own our time. But how much of a revolution did the dear old house experience? Prior to the arrival of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, from Harpers Ferry to Baltimore was a 3.5 day journey one way. Think about that the next time you're driving down Interstate 70. Even if you get caught in traffic, it's not so bad if you think about 3.5 days to get there. The railroad arrives in the 1830s, and here's the revolution. That same distance now is 3.5 hours. 3.5 hours. A consequence is this: John Brown. John Brown did not intend to fail at Harpers Ferry. he did not intend to be captured at Harpers Ferry. He made a miscalculation, and it was a bad one. One reason he became entrapped was because the United States Marines arrived on the railroad. The first time in American military history, that the railroad is used to respond to a national emergency. John Brown. The dear old house certainly witnessed John Brown and others.
The dear old house, as we said earlier, historically was the last homely house on the turnpike as you walked out of town or rode out of town, however you were leaving town. It was the first to welcome travelers to Harpers Ferry from the west, and the last to see them go. There's something special about that position, I always thought. Kind of like being a gatekeeper. Let's play a little game here, if you will. Step back in time with me. Let's step out onto the portico. I know it's small, but we can all fit. We're in our imaginations. And let's watch this traveler coming up from town, heading out into the west. Who is that now? Oh, it's that new fella. Oh, we like him. He's so sweet. You know, he's from up north, but he always dresses so nice. He's married a local girl, and you won't believe this. He writes poetry to her, and he publishes it in the newspaper, and it is so romantic. Anyway, I love it. It's too much. It's just too much. I've never seen anything like it. There he goes. It's a little late, but I'm sure he's fine. You know, he's been working on some books about George Washington. What a nice guy. And he's probably out late because he's a romantic. He's a poet. He's out here admiring the moon over the mountain. And how can we fault him for doing that? We do it ourselves, don't we? His name is John. Bye, John. Be safe. Have a good stroll.
What the dear old house did not know, and what no one knew in Harpers Ferry, with the exception of John's wife, is that John Cook was John Brown's advanced spy. And John Cook had been residing in Harpers Ferry and got to know the dear old house and others quite well. He'd been there for nearly a year and a half, gathering information, gathering intelligence for Brown. That night that John is leaving Harpers Ferry and going west out of town by the dear old house, he's on a mission. Brown has commenced his war against slavery, and in fact, the armory has already been seized. The arsenal and the armory are in the hands of Brown and his men. The railroad bridge across the Potomac is Brown's, his possession. But we're not finished. We have more work to do. Not only do we need to remove weapons, but we need hostages. And it is John Cook's job to get some hostages. So he's departing that night en route to the home of Colonel Lewis Washington, the great grandnephew of George, to bring him back as a prize of war. Hours pass. And the dear old house would see John again. But instead of heading west, he's coming east toward Harpers Ferry on the turnpike, coming into Bolivar, greeted once again by the dear old house. But this time he's not alone. With him is Washington, a hostage. With him is John Allstott Sr., a hostage. With him is John Allstott Jr., a hostage. Why these people? Why these men? Well, they do own slaves. But you know what the dear old house saw that night that it had never seen before? It had seen slaves, it had seen enslaved people. But there in the darkness and the shadows, as Louis Washington's wagon, captured by Cook, and Allstott's wagon, seized by Cook, passed by in the darkness, there are 11 formerly enslaved African Americans with them that were just a few hours ago the slaves of Washington and the slaves of Allstott. And they are guarding their owners. They're en route to what becomes John Brown's fort. And that's where they will be. Well, let me finish here. Brown's raid will, of course, lead to consequences, and the consequences will be the forthcoming war. Catherine has introduced one aspect of what the dear old house experiences in that war during the Battle of Harpers Ferry, September 1862. But unfortunately for Harpers Ferry, the Civil War is not one day like Antietam. It's not 3 days like Gettysburg. Harpers Ferry, the dear old house, as a result of a chain of events that Brown precipitates, will cause 1,400 consecutive days of war. And that results in more experiences for the DOH.
It begins with a flight.
Yes.
It begins with the destruction of the armory at Harpers Ferry and the consequential flight of the resident of the dear old house from Harpers Ferry to Washington, D.C. The person living in the dear old house at the time learned very quickly that remaining in Virginia would not be a good idea for him. And records indicate that he left very quickly and apparently desiring to remain loyal to the Union, relocated himself and his family to Washington so that he could continue serving the War Department in that capacity, in some capacity there. It continues for the dear old house, still struggling to maintain its role as shelter, that highest calling of any dwelling, especially in times of crisis. It continues as providing shelter to soldiers. I know this because of the graffiti that covers so much of the house, much of what eventually would become a walk-in closet for me. Graffiti that predominantly espouses a Union point of view. There are names. They left me their names, they left me their sketches of their faces, some of them really quite well done. They left me recipes, tips for how to cook my hardtack should I ever be so bored. And yes, the pandemic did get me to that point. I did try that. It was awful. Yeah. They left me an illustrated edition as well of that cookbook. They left me some cartoons and critiques of the Confederacy as they saw it, which is why, as I said, why I believe these all to be the work of Union soldiers staying in the house. What I always liked about the graffiti is that it's near a window that faces the west and has a really spectacular sunset. There's also a fireplace in that room. And on winter nights, I could always imagine as I would sit there by that fireplace that they might have sat there too and found a little comfort even as they were defacing the walls. That perhaps there was a little camaraderie in that room. Perhaps a little comfort was found so far from home, just as I found comfort in that room as well. Other signs of the war in that house that did not surprise me, or perhaps did surprise me, were the bayonets found in the walls and the bullets pulled out of the window casings and other elements found here and there between floorboards. But it was a house that endured multiple bombardments, battles, and a constant threat throughout those 1,400 days of war, as Dennis indicated.
Perhaps one of the saddest days witnessed by the dear old house is an event that few know of in Harpers Ferry. Incidentally, I mentioned 11 enslaved people that were in the engine house or in proximity of the engine house. What happened to them? We tell you what happens to them in Confluence. So this is a very sad day. It's just after the Battle of Harpers Ferry has ended. As you know, the Confederates are victorious. The largest surrender of United States troops in American history has occurred prior to World War II. And the Yankees are paroled. The federal forces are paroled, and they begin marching toward Annapolis. But there was another march. As the Federals were marching by the dear old house going east, there was another march that was heading west and south. And this was a march of almost 2,000 African Americans who were in Harpers Ferry during the battle and who, of course, were surrounded by those same Confederates. And they surrendered, of course, as did the Federal Army. They were there because of the protection of the Federal Army. They had escaped enslavement. They were free, these people, for the first time, not property, but people. And as a result of the Confederate victory, what the dear old house would witness would be 2,000 people, men, women, children, returned into the South as property. After the war, Harpers Ferry becomes a center of education for African Americans. And most of you know the story. We tell this story in Confluence. But what many people don't realize is how difficult it was at the beginning of Storr College's history. And I have a line in the book that says, the miracle of Storr College is not that it lasted 90 years, but that it lasted a year. It was not wanted. It was in the heart of a very racist, segregationist area. And despite that, the dear old house becomes a champion for civil rights.
Two of the earliest graduates of Storr College come to call the dear old house home. Not only did they come to call the dear old house their home, but I began to follow and research the ongoing careers of those two early graduates. These were two people that had experienced those very, very early days of Storer College, the days when teachers were being threatened with stoning and followed and harassed just for existing. After their graduation, after their teaching careers got rooted in the community, one of them went on to become the leader of a school for African American children in Harpers Ferry. As such, he eventually leads a fight to revolutionize his school. As the 20th century is dawning, Harpers Ferry wants to create a new school, two new schools in its community. At this time, schools remain very much segregated. So they are going to build one school for white children, and they're going to build a second school for everyone else. The school for the white children is going to be top of the line, 2 stories, nice large auditorium, gymnasium. There will be bathrooms for boys and girls with flush toilets and sinks, all the fancy things you would expect by the dawn of the 20th century. And those will be on both floors of this nice new building. The school for everyone else has not been budgeted a single bathroom. They do not even have an outhouse in their budget. They have been advised that they can go outside and use a tree. Eventually, a local church takes pity on them and allows them to use their facilities. But the caretaker of the dear old house, as the leader of this school, becomes the vocal forerunner of this movement to create something beyond separate but equal in Harpers Ferry. He is challenging the separate but equal standard that has been the status quo in Harpers Ferry. He's saying this is not fair, this is not humane. You can't expect children to go outside and do this. How can they possibly be learning in this environment? They don't even have an outhouse. He is finally successful in this endeavor. But that is one very small town story that is part of a much broader one in the challenge to overturn the Supreme Court's ruling on separate but equal education standards.
And yes, that is small town, but very big in the lives of these people day to day. But what is not small town was what happens at Harpers Ferry in 1906. And the dear old house would have witnessed this as well. The forerunner of Martin Luther King, which has been lost in American history today because he's been supplanted by King. A name that would have been known throughout America at the turn of the 20th century. Booker T. Washington, you know. This was his opponent. This was the man who opposed separate but equal, who opposed accommodation. W.B. Du Bois, a brilliant intellectual, Harvard graduated, incredible writer, teacher, scholar, comes to Harpers Ferry with an organized group of fellow African Americans, nearly 150 of them, to meet at Harpers Ferry to lay a foundation for civil rights. As all of you know, the Civil War terminates slavery, but the Civil War did not give us civil rights. And so in 1906, Du Bois issues a declaration, what I like to refer to as not the Declaration of Independence, but the Declaration of Civil Rights. We have it word for word in Confluence. It's not long. It's poignant, powerful, and memorable. Written as if King had written it himself, and probably delivered with the same force of oratory as king. But what the dear old house witnesses is a progression and a procession. Recall the one from 1862, the procession west of 2,000 African Americans returning to slavery. This time, the dear old house sees a procession that is progress. And this time, Du Bois is leading 150, approximately 150 African Americans west on the turnpike to the Murphy farm, just outside of Bolivar, just a short distance from the dear old house, overlooking the Shenandoah River, because that's where John Brown's fort is now. It had arrived on the Murphy farm in 1895. 10 years, 11 years later, Du Bois leads a pilgrimage to this site. And the dear old house witnesses this great leader in front of this pilgrimage, going to remember John Brown. One thing the dear old house never witnessed, and I think we can probably be thankful about this, are floods. At least not the kind that we had in the lower 10. That kind of flood, we're all in Noah's Ark. So it didn't have that kind of experience. That's the one thing in Confluence that we will share with you. Floods over again, along with lots of illustrations that have never been published before in the book of the floods. The dear old house, because of its elevation on the Bolivar Heights, escapes that. But those floods relate to the dear old house in this way. Those floods destroy Harpers Ferry as a business district where any kind of transaction, commercial transaction, will occur. By the 1936-1942 floods, Harpers Ferry is empty and a ghost of its former life. This has an effect upon others in the town. And then comes the bypass. No longer is the dear old house going to be on the main pass. But the bypass, the Potomac River Bridge, built in 1947, downstream from the ferry and the Confluence, and the Shenandoah River Bridge completed in 1949. And so now the dear old house is witnessing a new and very strange Harpers Ferry. And it doesn't look like a promising future. But we started with the Armory and the federal government, and we're going to conclude with the federal government and hope as Harpers Ferry is designated a national park.
Well, we know that it is, but it is not just because of the federal government. It is because of the work of many, many, many actors, because of the people in the community who cared. Here in Washington County, the leader of the Washington County Historical Society, Mary Vernon Mish, is largely responsible for the massive acres that come into the park from Maryland, including the iconic Maryland Heights cliffs and all of that mountain. That is the work of Mary Mish. She, along with several other very preservation-minded people in the early and mid-20th century, are pivotal in creating that national park. They are the ones that make the federal government care about that park existing. And because of that, people begin to return to Harpers Ferry. People start to move to Harpers Ferry because they want to be part of that story. They want to take part of that history. They start to think there's something here that matters, something that's worth sharing with others. In Confluence, we do talk a little bit about how the park was founded and some of those early challenges in getting the park up and running, and some of the preservation fights as well, bringing all those wonderful land tracts into the park. But it all boils down really to community members like you who care, who decide that places like Harpers Ferry matter, that these stories matter, and that even places like the dear old house matter. The last people who lived in the dear old house came there because they wanted to be in Harpers Ferry. They were not native to Harpers Ferry, just like I wasn't. They came there because they wanted to be in that place. They loved the history. Something about it touched their souls. And unfortunately, the house, nobody else cared for a while after they left. But then I came, and I said, yeah, this broken old house, I see these scars on the woodwork. I know there's a story here. I care. I want to find out what it is. And I put that house back together. And I never refer to myself as an owner of that house, only as a caretaker until it could be passed on to someone else. And it was big stuff. I'm very proud of how I left that house. It did not have stuff on the floor, no. But I hope you take that to heart when you think of old houses and the stories that they hold as you pass them by, even the sad ones, even the ones that people have forgotten.
So our story tonight has been about stories. And our story has been about taking a structure, which is not stone, not brick, not metal, not wood, but very much alive, that has experienced almost 180 years of life, and has been salvaged and preserved and protected by those who care, which is what we all do who love history. The dear old house represents the best of us. It represents that which is not really old and past, but which we want to care for and continue far beyond us into the future. And so Confluence, the book, was designed in many respects to mirror the story of the dear old house. People that had these adventures, had this trauma and drama, and witnessed it, saw it, and we spent hours searching for their tales so that we could tell them in their own words. And so no matter how much you know about Harpers Ferry, no matter how many times you've been there, no matter how familiar you are with Harpers Ferry, I can guarantee you Confluence will teach you something new. And why can I guarantee you that? Because Confluence taught both of us a lot of things we didn't know. And so it's been a great pleasure to be part of the McCauley series here this evening, and not do it by myself, but with my friend, Catherine, and my co-author, Catherine. And we hope that this is a different perspective for you in terms of how to view Harpers Ferry. And if you want to know where the dear old house is, it's still there on Washington Street. And it's still the last of the Harpers houses on Washington Street in Bolivar. As you travel to the west, the last that will meet you and the first that will meet you as you travel to the east. So the next time you're there, wave at the dear old house, salute the dear old house, and say, I know your story. Thank you all very much. Do you have any questions, Kate? We have time for any questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Anybody? Anybody have a question? Yes, sir. And I'll repeat it so everybody can hear.
Well, I'm curious about, you talked about the drawings and the graffiti things. Are they there? How was the preservation handled for that?
Basically, they had not been properly preserved. I was the first one to discover them rather accidentally.
Mm-hmm.
that I saw wallpaper was peeling and I peeled it. I'm surprised. Apparently worked. Now they are now covered, secured with plexiglass over them. Untreated, the walls are treated. Excuse me.
Good, thank you. You know, I wasn't surprised when she showed me the graffiti. Harpers Ferry, my goodness, Harpers Ferry ball houses. I've been in many of them. Are just there's graffiti everywhere. It's really incredible. I mean, that's a book by itself. Is to actually photograph the graffiti. It would be really interesting because a lot of these people left their names, just like they did in Captain. To research those names, those people. I did some of that in the park for the graffiti we had within the buildings in the park, and we were able to track them down and figure out who these people were. But boy, there's so many more in Harpers Ferry because so much of the architecture is extant in Harpers Ferry that did survive the American Civil War. So yeah, boy, that graffiti in her house is really extraordinary. And I remember the first time she showed it to me, I was not surprised, but I was astounded at the state of preservation of that graffiti. So clear, almost as if it had been written yesterday.
Has it been photographed?
Anybody else have a question? Yes, hi, Renee.
Hi, Dennis. You mentioned something I hadn't thought about, the John Brown raid as being a national emergency.
Yes.
In 1859, how was it recognized as a national emergency? What am I missing?
So the question is, how was I use the word national emergency for the John Brown, I don't call it the John Brown raid incident, I refer to it as John Brown's war.
Okay.
It was John Brown's war. Brown never used the word raid. No one associated with Brown ever used the word raid. That was a contrivance, the word raid, that came in the aftermath. And for decades and decades, I used the word raid myself. Harpers Ferry National Park used the word raid. The books used the word raid. It's not a raid. It's the commencement of a war. Brown did not intend to raid. He is going to war. And that was battle number one, Harpers Ferry. So the national emergency, when you notify the President of the United States that a national armory and arsenal has been captured, that's a national emergency, instantly. Brown, in essence, if I can be relevant to the 21st century, Brown has just seized a nuclear arms installation. That's in his possession. That's what's just happened. And I'm not hyperbolizing. There are only 2 federal armories in the country. One of them belongs to John Brown, who's just started a war against the United States. So yes, national emergency, absolutely. The president saw it that way. The Secretary of War saw it that way. John W. Garrett, president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, saw it that way. The press saw it that way. Boy, the press was all over this, within hours. Because of the telegraph, there's another revolution. So the John Brown War is communicated rapidly via telegraph all over the country. Newspaper articles, north and south, east and west. There's been nothing like it. It was the first mass media sensation in American history, the John Brown attack on Harpers Ferry.
Thanks.
Yeah. Anybody else? There's a lot of smiling faces, which is good. we like smiles. That's good. Any other questions we can answer? Yes.
Is the lovely old house in Bolivar or Harpers Ferry?
It's in Bolivar.
Okay. Close to the school?
Yeah, we'd be
Up that way.
it's heading up the hill, yeah.
Can you say anything about your writing process, working together? What that was like? How that
Yes.
happened?
Would you like to, I think that was really fascinating. Would you like to share about that and talk about what we were doing together? Let me start. So again, I did not expect help, did not want help, did not desire help. I was assigned help. Since the publisher was the association that Catherine is working for, I was not going to deny that assistance. I admit that at first, not knowing anything about her other than she was an attorney on sabbatical, I thought, oh boy, I've got a personal photocopier. I'm gonna find all this stuff and give it to her and say, please copy this for me. And that was my first attitude. That,
Dennis did most of the photocopying, by the way.
this is true. I ended up doing most of the photocopying myself. It didn't take long for me to discover her. She already knew a lot about Harpers Ferry, which astonished me. And secondly, she dug right deep. She was willing to dig into the archives and into the collections like I always did, but almost no one else ever did. I mean, I enjoyed having my nose dirty in those collections. Catherine got all of herself dirty in the collections. I mean, we just immersed into those collections and spent hours researching, looking for something new. We didn't want to be a regurgitate. We didn't want to regurgitate Harpers Ferry history. We wanted to give you something that was going to be fresh and new. And so we were searching and searching and searching for that. And that's how we learned a lot, both of us, because we didn't know many of the things we discovered because we didn't know they were there to be discovered until we found them. And so it was very synergetic. It was very dynamic. We had a lot of creative discussions. We talked a lot about what we wanted to include, how we wanted to share it, how we wanted to present it. And then we wouldn't have a book without Catherine, because Catherine did all the hard work, which was design of the book. We have over 200 illustrations in the book. Again, many of them never before published. You talk about that, please, because you did that incredible design. And incidentally, the design was done in the dear old house. She did the design of the book. The book was born in the dear old house.
I think we also need to mention that all of this happened in the midst of, I think, what is still the longest government shutdown in history.
Yeah.
A flood shutdown.
Yeah.
And some other disaster that has now palled in comparison to the pandemic.
We did get it done before the pandemic, so we didn't have that disaster.
Yeah, but when we were relying on museum spaces in a national park, a federal space, this somewhat complicated things. So we had to get creative and use other spaces, university libraries, public libraries. We were here. We had to use private collections, reach out to our community. So a lot of things that we wound up photographing and using in the book. Actually, some of the cover art, I think, actually is from one of those private collections that came out of that weird period of what are we going to do now? So definitely a lot of creativity and outside the box thinking. As far as the, we also had a design team that had a personal disaster along the way. We weren't going to meet our deadline of, we really wanted this book out in time for the park's 75th anniversary. And suddenly we had 23 days. And so suddenly I was called upon to design a book in 23 days. And that's what I did. Yeah.
Where is
Hi.
the finished product?
What?
Where is the finished product?
What?
Do you have any
In these books?
Yeah, we have some up here.
Oh, okay.
I'd like to take one home with you. I'm sure we can make that happen.
Yeah, the greatest honor for, you all know this, my goodness, you're authors, you're fellow authors. The greatest honor for any author, of course, is to become part of your home and become part of your own personal library. So we have Confluence this evening for anyone that may be interested. Remember, the proceeds benefit the association, and have a special deal tonight. $20 usually runs you with tax and everything between 23 and 24, so just straight 20. But if anybody's interested, we'd be happy to share Confluence with you, and certainly be happy to personalize it for you as well. So our time is up. We appreciate you being here, coming out on this very damp, cold October night. And Catherine and I, it means a lot to have you here for both of us. So thank you so much.